Ingmar is the research director for the social computing at the Qatar Computing Research Institute in Doha, Qatar. The interdisciplinary work that he studies uses online user-generated data to garner information about the offline world and society at large. And the work that he's done is truly interdisciplinary work that is in conjunction with sociologists, demographers, and amongst the multiple branches that he studied in the past, he's truly pioneered the use of using online advertising data to glean information on statistics on international migration, digital gender gaps, and on poverty. And these tools have been used by UN agencies, NGOs ranging from Colombia to the Philippines. So there is, in the MD4SG spirit, this bridging of research and practice is embodied with the vast body of work that Ingmar and his group has done over the years. And before QCRI, Ingmar was a researcher at Yahoo Research in Barcelona, and previously he was at Cambridge as an undergrad and completed his PhD at the Max Planck Institute for Computer Science. And with that, I'd like to give the mic to Ingmar, so he can talk to us about precisely this line of work on using digital advertising data on important development issues. So thank you so much, Ingmar. I'll let you kind of take it away.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Francisco, for the introduction. And also thanks, Anna, for the opportunity to present our work. So yeah, the work that I'll present today is joint work with a number of other people. So here at the Qatar Computing Research Institute, my colleagues Joao and Masumali. Then at the University of Oxford, there's Ricky Kashyap, but many other people, also including at UN agencies and NGOs. So it's really like a group effort that I have the pleasure to present. So let me start with a slogan that probably you've heard before, right? So if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product, right? So services that you're using online that are sort of supposedly for free, right, are not really for free, right? I mean, they have some business model behind. And so what is their business model, for example, for Facebook, right? So Facebook collects a lot of information about their users. And then this information is used to build up like certain profiles about you, right? Like, okay, this seems to read a lot about this topic. He likes content about this other topic based on maybe his IP address. He's moving around, sort of, right? And so they then derive certain attributes about you. And then advertisers can show ads to you using these attributes for targeting. Right, so here to give you like a real world example, I can go to Facebook and say, okay, I want my ad only to be seen by female Facebook users living in London, age 25 to 29, who lived in Poland, right? This is already a bit more interesting, and to use an iOS device, right? So I mean, based on the sort of the meta information on sort of the app you have installed, Facebook knows the sort of device that you're using. And then the crucial thing that we're using in our work is that before you launch your campaign, and so before you have to pay anything, Facebook provides so-called audience estimates of how many people match your targeting criteria. So this is usually used for budget planning, right? Because maybe I want to sell, I don't know, some iPhone app to young Polish women or something. Then I need to know, right? Like, are there like 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, right? This of course affects my sort of campaign consideration, right? So in this particular case, Facebook won't then tell me, again, before I launch my campaign, that there are 2,600 monthly active users matching these criteria, right? So and again, I get this information before I launch my ad, and I get and also free of charge. So this gives a no cost, again, because I haven't launched the ad yet, right? I'm not paying anything yet. Real time, right? So these estimates are more or less like maybe plus minus like a week or two sort of old, but fairly real time. And so they give you like a real-time census over the 3 billion Facebook users, right? Where I can basically ask, of these 3 billion users, how many match certain criteria, right? And so in this line of work, right, we ask, how can we use such data for remote social sensing? Sorry, there's my daughter also wants to listen. So let me actually share another screen to show this very, very concretely what this looks like, the sort of data that you can obtain through these platforms. So okay, let me just briefly so this is what I'm showing you here. is Facebook's advertising platform. So here I'm about to launch an advertising campaign, and I'm selecting my target audience. So here I am selecting people living in a particular location. So far, the location I've selected is Norte de Santander. So this is the country of Colombia here on the left, and then you have the country of Venezuela here on the right. And so far, I've left it broad otherwise. So age 18 and above, all genders. And then here you see this thing that I was referring to. This is a so-called audience estimate, right? So Facebook tells me that there are between 1 and 1.2 million people matching my targeting criteria, okay? I can disaggregate this, for example, by gender, right? Like if I wanted to get a sense of what's the sort of the, sort of digital gender divide in terms of sort of Facebook users in Colombia, and I think it's fairly gender balanced sort of. So actually it's skews slightly a female. So there's only one dimension, right? The gender dimension might be interesting to look at. But also quite interesting is you can look at how many of these people Facebook believes to have lived in Venezuela, right? So now let's only look at Facebook users who are now living in Colombia, right? The neighboring country, but who supposedly used to live in Venezuela, right? So again, so then Facebook gives me an estimate here, right? And then furthermore, I can also look at the device types they use to access Facebook. I can ask, okay, of these, Facebook users who used to live in Venezuela, how many are using an iOS device, right? So iOS devices are typically more expensive. I don't see it's a fairly small percentage of the total. That can be even more specific and sort of say, look, only at a particular sort of iPhone. Now, just to show you what you can do with this data. So here's a data visualization that we created for New York City. So the data is not live. So this is sort of data we collect a couple of years ago, where we would ask in a particular zip code, how many Facebook users are women with a university degree in a particular age range, etc. So now what can you sort of infer from this data? So for example, let me start with the device type. What you see now is a sort of density distribution of iOS users. So let me explain this. So here is sort of the banking district, sort of Manhattan and Midtown, where you have about 90% of Facebook users using iOS devices. On the other end, in the Bronx, you only have about sort of 40 to 50% of Facebook users using iOS devices, right? So based on this, you would sort of correctly assume that there's like a wealth differential, probably more wealth in this area and less wealth in another area. Give you another example. If you look at countries where people have used to live before, I can sort of look at where are people who used to live in Latin America, where do they live now? So the density is quite high in this part of the Bronx, so upwards of sort of 40%, and it's lower in the rest of New York City, right? So you can sort of get like a rough sense of sort of distribution. Now, for New York City, you have census data, so I'm not telling you anything you can't know through other sources, but let me show you another city. So, oops, 1 second. So here, this is Doha, the city where I'm in sort of center. Do something similar. Let's look at people who used to live in Nepal. So their density is highest in the so-called industrial area. So if you later Google industrial area Doha, you will read about how this area was actually built to house people from sort of South and Southeast Asia. Sort of. So this is really where a lot of Nepalis are found. They're almost all men, so these are mostly sort of blue-collar construction workers. They're fairly young, which is a blessing during sort of COVID time, sort of also, because a lot of them have been infected, but only very, very few deaths have been recorded. And they're almost all Android device users, right? So 94% are using Android devices. Now I can contrast this with other demographic groups in the country. For example, I can look at people who used to live in sort of Western Europe, such as myself, and not coincidentally, right now I'm actually here, so a completely different part of town. I'm here with my wife and family, so it's roughly sort of gender balanced. A lot of university graduates, you have older people, and you have more iOS device users than Android devices. Right? This already gives you like a sense of, right? So there's something on gender, something maybe on income, something on migration background. And again, I can do this in other cities as well. Where we have collected data, so here I'm showing this Lagos is another example. Let's look at sort of device distribution. So Lagos Island, where the government is located, you have about sort of 15% using iOS devices, right? iOS devices are typically more expensive than the rest of Lagos, drops from 15 to about 7%. and then the sort of the suburbs sort of drops further to sort of 4 or 5%, right? You would assume, and most likely correctly assume, that sort of the government district has higher levels of wealth. So with this, let me go back to my slides, because I wanted to show this very sort of concretely. Okay, this is all. So to collect the data, we don't have to do any screen scraping. There actually is very nicely documented APIs. And on top of this, a colleague of mine worked with the World Bank to put together some sort of additional nice wrapper API. So this is being recorded, so you'll have the link also there, and maybe I'll drop it later also in the chat if you're interested in collecting this data yourself. So now, okay, so what do we do with this other than put together some nice sort of visualizations? So again, so broadly speaking, we're interested in monitoring global development. So what's wrong with existing data on global development? Well, it lacks on, at least in sort of 3 dimensions. So one is sort of the speed of updates, right? So it's slow, right? So often data is sort of tied to decennial censuses, right? So you might have data that's 10 years out of date, right? And just imagine running a company with data that's sort of 10 years out of date, right? But that's realistically what a lot of governments are doing for certain parts of their sort of economy and society. Even when data is available, it's often spatially coarse, right? So for example, some data is available at the level of states in India. Okay, and it might sound good, but then a state such as Uttar Pradesh has 200 million people, right? So you have one data point summarizing the lives of 200 million. I mean, clearly that's not very useful, right? I mean, there's long, the variance is sort of lost sort of right, in this sort of single data point. And even if it does, disaggregate sort of spatially, then maybe it's only at the household level, right? So you look at like wealth or sort of other outcomes at the household level, but that hides, for example, how women are doing, right? So maybe the male head of the household is doing well, but women are not, sort of, right? And so this is sort of 3 dimensions that we try to address, right? We try to have more recent data, we try to have it spatially, granular, and we try to have it sort of disaggregated in particular by gender. So in the rest, time. So the rest of my presentation, I'll run through sort of 3 examples. So one looks at international migration, in particular on Venezuela. One looks at mapping poverty, and one looks at sort of tracking digital gender gaps. So let's start with the first one. So this is joint work in particular with UNHCR, UNICEF, and an NGO called IMAP. So just for background, I mean, I'm sure many of you are familiar with what's going on or is going on in Venezuela. So just to show some statistics. So in 2019, according from estimates from the International Monetary Fund, the inflation in Venezuela was 10 million%. This is not a typo, it's really 10 million%, right? Sort of as hyperinflation ever gets. Again, these sort of official estimates estimate that at least 40% of the population, of the working population, was unemployed. If you were making minimum wage and you spend every single, I believe it's peso on food, you could only afford 1,000 calories per day, right? Sort of, which is of course not enough to survive, right? The so-called Maduro diet. People were literally sort of starving. And, of course, as a response, a lot of people have left the country. So at least 15% or so of the population, maybe even more, mostly into neighboring countries, but some a bit further away. Now, as often is the case, in sort of the humanitarian sort of, migration and refugees crisis, you don't have a lot of data on what's going on. And so this is what we try to help with. So let me try to explain what you see here in this graph that sort of summarizes some sort of temporal trends of the out-migration out of Venezuela. So we're always looking at people from Venezuela in different host scenarios. So let's look at the data in red, which is for the host country of Colombia. So destination is always Venezuela. Here's the host country of Colombia. This data point down here is just the raw number of monthly active users, or Facebook users, always Facebook, who lived in Venezuela, and at this time, sort of June 2018, were living in Colombia. I mean, previously I showed you the estimate for Norte de Santander, which is part of Colombia. So this is for the whole country of Colombia as of sort of, June 2018. So we're like about 1 million people who had most likely already left Venezuela at that point in time. Now that's most likely an underestimate, right? Because assuming there are no false positives in how Facebook classifies people, of course, not everybody is on Facebook, right? So we would now need to sort of correct for the Facebook penetration among the Venezuelan refugees and migrants. Now we don't know this. For this, we have to know how many people were then we could but so now we make an assumption, right? We basically assume that the Facebook penetration among Venezuelans in Colombia is the same as the Facebook penetration among people in Colombia in general. So basically, we look at what's total population in Colombia, what's the total population, what's the total Facebook user population in Colombia. We compute the Facebook penetration in all of Colombia, and then we sort of use this to correct for this, right? So maybe in all of Colombia at 60%, so 40% are missing. So we're sort of adding 40% on top to obtain this other estimate here, right? So this is a very, very simple assumption, sort of correcting for not everybody being on. Here, I think somebody is not mute. Sorry, if you could just mute yourself. Sorry. In black here, I'm showing sort of ground truth. I mean, yeah, ground truth is a stronger word. Let's say reference data to compare against from different UN reports for all of Latin America. So here in gray, you have sort of Facebook-derived estimates for all of Latin America, and here in black, you have sort of data from different UN reports. So I need to see that they're sort of broadly in line. Sorry, is there a question? Please go ahead and interrupt. Somebody raised.
Hi, Ingmar. There's a question in the chat from Jesse asking if the binary value lived in Venezuela is based on self-reported history or is it inferred, for example, from location access over time?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And ultimately, we don't know for sure. It's a bit of a black box. So we can, maybe I'll get to that sort of later, but it's certainly inferred. But inferred using also self-declared information, if that makes sense, as one of the features. But I'll get to back to sort of the black box issue. What does this mean, right? If Facebook believes you lived in Venezuela at the end, that's definitely a crucial question and one of the key limitations or challenges when doing this sort of work. What does it mean, sort of? So just getting back to sort of some sort of validation, at least at the sort of regional level for all of Latin America. So you get estimates that are at least plausible and probably higher than UN estimates, but that's also not at least plausible so that these other estimates are undercounts. And to elaborate a bit on sort of, let's say, sort of ground truth and sort of issues with the ground truth, here's a subnational plot for Colombia. So here on the left, you see data from the Colombian government about, was collected in sort of mid-2018. It was based on self-registration. Right? So basically, Colombian refugees and migrants were asked to, please, self-register sort of to be counted. Right? So this is, you see the spatial distribution here on the left. On the right, you see the spatial distribution as derived from Facebook, around the same, time point. And you see some sort of similarities, right? So before I was showing Norte de Santander, right? There's definitely like a flashpoint sort of on the border. But then Facebook also picks up more people further away from the border compared to official government data, right? And now is the question, okay, who's right or wrong, sort of. So now, because we were working with people in Colombia, on the response, they actually got back to us and said, you know what, this data is more plausible, sort of. So based on what we see on the ground, we have more faith, if that's maybe too strong a word, but at least it's sort of more aligned with their observations. And one of the reasons is that their sort of self-registration efforts were more pronounced closer to the border and not so much further away sort of from the border when it comes to sort of, advertising, etc. There's another question, please, if it's correct, please go ahead.
Another question from Michael on the chat. Could it be the case that all Venezuelan population is to be on Facebook since they're outside of the country? They would need tools to stay in contact with their home country.
Could it? Yes, that could be. So for example, our estimate in terms of this assumption in terms of Facebook penetration might well be false, right? If we're only counting 100%, then this would be the true number, sort of. So then in our case, you'd go with this number rather than this other number. So that is it is a possibility that the Facebook penetration is higher among Venezuelans than among sort of Colombians. Absolutely plausible, sort of. So having said that, in other work, in other contexts, we found that the destination country correlates more strongly with sort of Facebook usage than the origin country. So basically, if you're moving to like a high Facebook usage country, then you're more likely to sort of use Facebook than if you're moving to low Facebook usage country, regardless of your country of origin. Now, we don't know if this applies in this context as well, but at least that's what we've observed in other contexts. But that's definitely, yeah, it's a possibility, sort of. So getting back to sort of the sort of spatial distribution again, sort of, so we don't know, again, we don't have sort of gold standard data to compare against, but we have some evidence to believe that these sort of the spatial distribution from Facebook data is actually closer to the truth than the sort of government data, which is sort of interesting. Now, for other countries, we don't have data to compare against, but again, we can also obtain such estimates for other countries. And just to mention Brazil, we were working with UNICEF on the targeting for an anti-xenophobia campaign they were running. And initially, they were only targeting the north of the country, but then based on our data, it seems that there was also like a presence sort of further south, and so they actually adjusted the targeting of that campaign. And so then hopefully that improved the outcome, but again, we don't have the sort of the counterfactual. Now we can do more than just the number of people, and we can also get a sense of their socioeconomic situation. So let me try to explain how that's done. So in this graph, every bar is again a different sort of host country or host region. So we're always looking at people from Venezuela, right? So everything's always from Venezuela, let's say in Argentina. Right? Now the sorting of these bars is by percentage of iOS usage. Okay, so for example, here in Roraima, Brazil, which is in the jungle, typically you sort of walk there, so you only have about 3% of Facebook users using iOS devices. It's quite low, sort of in any sort of context. At the other end of the scale, people who make it all the way to the US, they actually, the majority of them is using iOS devices, so 54% when we're sort of collecting the data. Right? So this induces the order. Now, how do we get to some estimate of the sort of GDP per capita, or let's think of it as sort of per capita income in a sense? Right, sort of, how is that done? Well, for this, we train a regression model that predicts per capita GDP using only the percentage of Facebook users using iOS in that country. So for example, if you tell me, I don't know, in Chile, 30% of Facebook users are using iOS, making this up, then our model would maybe predict that Chile, the country, has a per capita GDP of $24,000 a year. I mean, as an example, not a sort of real example, right? So we predict country level GDP. Now this model that maps, 30% to $24,000, let's say, if that's sort of the mapping, is now applied to these subgroups, right? It's now applied to these Venezuelan migrants in different contexts, so just looking at the percentage of them using iOS devices, right? So this gives us this estimate, right? The equivalent, if this was a country looking at the iOS devices, we would think it's a rich country or a poor country, basically, right? Like with some, sort of actual dollar value. Now the precise dollar value is not meaningful or so I'm not going to go that far, but we do observe in all of our work, also when we use different features, when we do some sort of, remove some countries or robustness checks, all these kind of things, that these three groups always emerge, right? Where we're reasonably comfortable to say that, people who make it only sort of to neighboring countries, essentially, they're probably worst off in terms of socioeconomic situation. People who make it sort of a bit further away, but still mostly sort of in Latin America, right? They are still already like one step better. And then people who make it all the way to the US or Spain are in a sense of least concern. At least they are most likely to have access to high-end devices. Please, yeah, go ahead. I think there's another question.
A question in the chat from Arushi. Does Facebook have data on phone model? There would be plenty of variation in income within iOS users too.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So they do, but then at some point we run into sparsity concerns. So there's like a certain smallest group we can target, but absolutely we can look at only iPhone and non-iOS users, iPhone 13, 12, 14, whatever it is, versus 10, 11 or right, or older models. So it's absolutely possible. Again, modulo the sparsity concerns. Once you go below essentially 1,000 users, Facebook no longer tells you estimates sort of to protect user privacy. Having said that, we find again and again in different contexts, also in the context of Lebanon, looking at Syrian refugees, and in many other contexts, that just the simple iOS versus Android, even though there's a lot of diversity, generally works quite well. There are exceptions. The most notable exception is what's going on in South Korea, right? Sort of also, right, where you have a lot of, I mean, so this, the sort of Samsung's country, sort of. So we have a lot of people using Android devices, even though it's a fairly high income country, right? So definitely there will be some variation, right, due to tariffs, maybe only on iOS devices or something, but by and large, just iOS versus Android is pretty good at the group level. Right. So yeah. So just okay. So to wrap this up again, this went beyond just academic work. It continues to be used also operationally by IMAP, also in work with US AID. So now they are independently sort of collecting this data, which we are very glad about, and continuing to use it. Going back to the sort of black box issue, not everything is rosy with this. So here's a screenshot of a dashboard we created for UNHCR that in this case shows data for the host country of Brazil, and also disaggregated by self-declared relationship status and a lot of other things. Now, one of the things you'll notice is this dip here, sort of. So where in like March, mid-March, I forgot this precise date, in 2019, there was a sudden dip, sort of. So I don't know. So what's going on, right? Are people continuing from Brazil to, I don't know, Argentina, or are they returning to Venezuela? What's going on there? Well, what's going on there is a change in Facebook's algorithm. And how do we know? How do we know it's not something real? Well, we know because we collect sort of migration data regularly globally, and we observed a discontinuity for all origin destination pairs around the same time, right? And so, going back to the very valid question, how Facebook knows, what's the sort of the inference model, it runs. I mean, we have some idea about the features that go into this inference, but the precise model is also not static, right? Can change any day for no reason at all, right? And so this is, another sort of challenge in terms of sort of operationalizing these things, right? Like so the black box can change. Francisco, please.
Just a quick question, I guess, related to this. We've seen in the news the changes to the iOS privacy settings are having an impact on what Facebook is gleaning. Are you seeing changes like this presently with these changes in the data that you're looking at?
Yeah, very good question. We don't see those because I think we haven't looked. So my understanding is that this affects mostly things such as interest that Facebook would infer about you, because maybe based on other websites you sort of go to, right? And these interests are generally sort of quite noisy and sometimes a bit harder to interpret, So in most, I mean, we have used them in some of our work, but for this line of work, we're not using anything related to interest. So everything that I'm showing you here is data that Facebook knows just from what's going on Facebook itself, right? There's no iOS setting where you can hide your gender from Facebook because you have to provide that when you sign up, right? So those things have not been affected at all. So there's been no change. But you are quite right that I think when it comes to looking at interest profile, there will probably be now more and more biases where iOS users might seem more disinterested in general or something, but that is just based on my speculation. I don't have specific data on that.
Great, thank you.
Right. Okay, so I'll. Okay, yeah, I think I should have enough time to cover this. So, moving on. So, I already hinted at sort of examples of, right, like, so device type probably links to sort of socioeconomic situations. So let's dig a bit deeper on this. So this is work that we're doing on mapping poverty. So no poverty, as you might know, is one of these 17 sustainable development goals. There are different definitions of poverty. So the one that's used by the UN for most of their work relates to sort of income-based poverty. Looks at basically how much money do you earn per day. Available data on poverty is often outdated. So again, it's often tied to census, right? So if this is tied to the last census round, this has not yet been processed in many of these countries. So you have data that might be sort of 10 years old or older. And then again, there's sort of this issue of sort of spatial spatial granularity, right? Like you want something at the sort of sub-city level, right? Especially if you want to sort of target successful interventions. So what is it that we're doing here? So here we are using data from the DHS, the Demographic and Health Survey, which is a big, survey that's run in many years across many waves now, looking at number of different sort of things related to, well, demographics and health. One of the things they do is they create a wealth index where they basically ask a set of asset owner-based questions, where they would ask, do you have a fridge? Do you have running water? Do you have a mobile phone? Do you have a motorcycle, etc.? And then they sort of compile these answers using principal component analysis into a single index, where the index for a household or the index for an area is just a measure of sort of how much stuff do people own in that area. Like a large positive number means a lot of stuff, a large negative number means not so much stuff, and sort of 0 is like the sort of global average. And so we try to predict this definition of wealth, this asset-based definition of wealth. We try to predict this using features in particular from Facebook, right? So one of the very strongly predicted features is just the percentage of the Facebook, the percentage of the population that is on Facebook. So the Facebook penetration, right? So just if I tell you there's an area that has like 90% Facebook penetration versus an area that's only, I don't know, 5%, you'll probably assume, well, if they're only 5% on Facebook, probably, you know, there's also internet access might be missing and a lot of other things, right? So this is one strongly predictive feature. The device type is strongly predictive, as we mentioned, sort of Android versus iOS. But then there's also information on connectivity type, sort of, so whether you use Wi-Fi or 4G to connect. That also turns out to be a predictive feature. So once you have some sort of ground truth to sort of to train a model on, once you have your features, it becomes a standard regression task, right? There's no innovation going on this point. You can just try your favorite regression model and sort of see what works best. In this particular case, sort of gradient boosting machines work best, but you know, try whatever you like. And so, how well does this sort of work then in practice? So let me try to walk you through this sort of the summary slide. So we did this in two contexts, in the Philippines and in India. So here, so one question is always, you know, what is the baseline? So you know, I mean, everything correlates with everything, so it's easy to show, you know, Facebook data correlates with wealth, and we can predict wealth with some, you know, amount of accuracy, you know, done. Well, that's not really meaningful, right? So what would be alternatives, right? So one alternative we compared against was to sort of interpolating, looking at your neighbors, right? So you know, maybe you want to predict for a location that was not surveyed, but you have nearby locations that were surveyed, right? So you look at, well, okay, all of your 3 neighbors or 5 neighbors, you know, are areas of high wealth, so you're an area of high wealth, right? So this is sort of this sort of baseline, right? And this baseline already performs quite well, right? So in the Philippines, it explains about half of the variance. This is out of sample variance. In India, it's actually sort of 2/3 of the variance is explained by just looking at your spatial sort of neighborhood, right? Sort of, so it's very strongly sort of spatially correlated, right? Sort of, so right. So it's sort of like the baseline.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to, there's a question, I think, specifically on this, where Arushi Kalra is asking, what is the administrative unit, neighborhood, block, or district, which is at which prediction is being done, especially in India?
Yeah.
So I guess they're completely in line with what you're saying right now.
Yeah, very good question. Sorry, I didn't mention. So, so these, so we work with these DHS clusters. So these are sort of basically points, not directly representative of any sort of administrative unit. They're just sort of individual sort of points that come with a latitude and a longitude. Now these points have been perturbed though to sort of protect sort of privacy sort of also. So this now sort of introduces some sort of noise. So in an urban setting, I think they perturb up to either 2 or 5 kilometers. I forgot this, and in a rural setting up to sort of 10 kilometers sort of. So this now, it means effectively, even though they tell us a precise latitude longitude, this could be anywhere, you know, sort of 10 kilometers around in this sort of urban area. This introduces then also some noise in terms of the ground truth, and maybe I'll elaborate on that sort of later. But other than that, it's just sort of points. Some points have been sort of sampled, and we sort of basically hide points and try to predict the values for the other points to get a value of, you know, how well we are doing. Right. So a good question. Yeah. Thanks for asking that. Okay. So one baseline is you sort of look at your neighboring points. So that already performs quite well, in particular in India. Then let's look at only the Facebook features, including the Facebook penetration, which is a highly predictive sort of features. And you sort of see, okay, this also performs quite well. So in the Philippines, you actually beat this baseline, this looking out at your neighbors. In India, you don't beat that baseline, but it should perform reasonably well. And then sort of, you add additional features. For example, we add this regional indicator or this regional dummy, right? So maybe the sort of poverty dynamics in Kerala are different from Uttar Pradesh or something, and sort of so. And so this then, and also adding just population density, and this then sort of further improves the model. And if you sort of then also bring in sort of your neighborhood, you maybe improve it further, at least in the case of India. So these are quite respectable numbers, but to make them even more respectable, there's a certain upper bound, because again, I mentioned that the ground truth is not perfect. They perturb it. That's the biggest source of noise. But then also it's just a sample, right? It's not an enumeration. So there's some sort of sampling noise. And so for the sampling noise, we try some sort of bootstrap resampling to get an estimate of just how noisy the things are. And for the sort of spatial perturbation, we do some sort of simulation where we sort of perturb it again, sort of, and assume the original value was sort of true, to see how big the impact of these spatial perturbations are. And so in combination, that basically means is that sort of the ground truth with itself, if that makes sense, only explains about sort of 84% of its own variance, sort of, so in sort of different iterations of sort of ground truth generation with sort of like a round of spatial perturbation and resampling in between, right? So if you could sort of consider that as a sort of like upper bound, again, you're explaining the vast majority of spatial variation that can be explained. And now going, now going beyond just the, sorry, there's another question, please.
There's another question in the chat from Sophia. In terms of Facebook users being an indicator for GDP, do you have figures for countries where Facebook has been pushing like Facebook Wi-Fi or where Facebook Free Basic is used? She said, I believe Myanmar has enormous Facebook penetration, but not a comparable GDP.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we have not looked at predicting country GDP by Facebook penetration, sort of. So in the previous work on Venezuela, I mentioned we used the percentage of iOS to predict per country GDP, sort of. However, within a country, we observe that Facebook penetration is a strong predictor of poverty, sort of. So even if we bring in others, always, the model always picks up the Facebook penetration itself as a model. So of course, within a country, there might be reasons that, again, maybe there's one state of India where I don't know, Facebook was pushing really hard, and another one where it wasn't, sort of, like, right? So that might create problems for our model. Although so far we have, like a sort of the state level dummy, but so there could be something of this. No, but I have not looked specifically at this sort of which countries are sort of over and underperforming in terms of sort of GDP per capita versus sort of Facebook penetration. Underperforming maybe in terms of Facebook penetration, right? I'm originally from Germany. And certainly Germany has a very low Facebook penetration, sort of, given its general high level of internet connectivity, right? So due to cultural reasons. I mean, I have a Facebook account, but it's literally, I have like 0 friends, 0 posts. I only use it to access some sort of services, sort of, just as a story. Also, another question, please.
One more question about from Arushi. Please feel free to defer this question if you're going to get to it later, but she's wondering, how do the predictions using Facebook data compare to wealth predictions using satellite data, like night lights data?
Very good question. Yeah, not in this work, but in other work, we have looked at actually not night lights, but more recent work looking at high resolution daytime satellite imagery. And there we found that in the Philippines, in the urban context, so in urban areas, Facebook was better. In the rural context, satellite alone was better. And then when you combine everything, you get the best of both worlds. In India, I believe high resolution daytime satellite imagery was better, sort of, so both in urban and in rural areas. But in India, again, it's a special case. I mean, so special because the spatial autocorrelation is very, very high in India, so as I sort of mentioned, so that, yeah, is but it's a good question. So there's some complementary strength. Also, there recently, after we did this work, Facebook itself put out, this paper with also Joshua Blumenstock on predicting the wealth index, and there they used both satellite imagery and Facebook data, but there also Facebook data was always picked up as an important predictor in their model, which also sort of echoes our findings, sort of. So again, there might be some urban versus rural and maybe country difference, but overall there is some sort of complementary strength. But apart from just sort of predicting general levels of poverty, one of the reasons, and this now brings me to this slide, was that we want to have a more disaggregated view, right? Like in particular, sort of looking at sort of different demographics, and that's harder to do through satellite imagery because you sort of don't see into the household in a sense, right? You see just sort of overall levels of wealth or poverty, but not so much the sort of how it's sort of distributed across different demographics. And so here, what I'm showing you in this plot is a disaggregation by education level. Okay, so how does this work? So we don't have education level. The ground truth is not disaggregated by education level, but we train a model that sort of just makes general sort of wealth index predictions. And let's say, it looks at percentage iOS usage as a feature. Now that model is now applied just to those Facebook users who self-declare to be university graduates, for example, right? So of those, maybe there's a higher percentage using iOS than among those Facebook users who self-declare to be not, university graduates, right? And then based on this, we get these predictions. So here, every dot is a cluster. So every cluster is a geographic location. And this is the area where we predict that people with a self-declared university degree have a higher predicted wealth index than, and here's the area where people without a self-declared university degree have a higher wealth index, right? And so this model would predict, which is at least plausible, that generally people with a higher education level are sort of better off, right? At least plausible sort of. So it would be interesting to look at sort of these sort of outliers here. Sorry, there's another question. Please.
A question from Liz Evans in the chat. Does the data capture subsidiary affiliated companies to Facebook, such as WhatsApp and Instagram?
Very good question. It can. So on the platform that I showed, you can specify whether you want just Facebook or just Instagram or just Messenger or any combination of those. WhatsApp, I'm going to say unfortunately here in quotes, does not yet have advertising. If WhatsApp was to have advertising, then hopefully it would be targetable through the same interface. But this also brings me to a point I'll make later. I mean, here we're talking about Facebook, but exactly the same setup works for Snapchat, works for Contact here, works for Weibo, works for Twitter. They all have, targeting at platforms like this. We're just using Facebook in most of our work because it's sort of the biggest game in town. But for example, we have used LinkedIn data quite a bit, looking at sort of employment-related issues. So it's the LinkedIn advertising platform, I should say, again, where you can sort of say, oh, I want to show an ad on young women interested in computer science or who studied at a certain university or something, and then LinkedIn would tell you how many people match these targeting criteria. So yeah, it's in this particular what I'm showing you right here on the screen. It's only Facebook proper, not Instagram, nothing else. But you could as well have included Instagram and other platforms, or Snapchat, or something else. Right. Okay. So here. Okay, so here I was basically trying to show that you can make demographically disaggregated predictions of wealth index, even though you don't have demographically disaggregated ground truth, right? So this is sort of interesting, right? So we can't necessarily validate this but we can at least make sort of plausible predictions. So here, this seems plausible, right? Higher education seems to be linked to higher predicted wealth index. Now this thing, what I'm showing you here, is not plausible. So let me show you what you're seeing here now. So here we're trying to do the same thing, disaggregating by gender, right? So we're predicting just the wealth index for women, and we're predicting wealth index just for men, sort of. Right? Again, every data point here is a location, sort of. Right? And now you'd see something that's odd, at least if you know the Indian context, that it sort of shows essentially gender equality, right? It's very close to the identity line, sort of. So now this is not plausible. So here, I'm showing data from the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report. And this report ranks India 149th in terms of economic participation. So in terms of gender equality for economic participation, out of 153 countries, right? So generally, India is sadly known to lack in terms of gender equality, right? So if now we come back, India is a gender equal country, that's not plausible. So what has gone wrong here? So what's gone wrong here is a particular type of survivorship bias called the Jackie Robinson effect. So Jackie Robinson was the first African-American Major League Baseball player, sort of, who was in the 50s, or sorry if I get the year sort of wrong, sort of. Now for him to make it as an African-American, despite all the systematic racism, he had to be exceptional, right? I mean, if you look at his betting average, he was like an all-time great sort of. So now if you only observe him and then from him extrapolate out, you would think all African-Americans must be amazing baseball players, right? Because those are the only ones you see, right? They have to be, otherwise you wouldn't see them despite all the, because of all the racism, right? Something similar is happening in India, sort of, right? So it's a very ungender equal country. And so those women that we do observe on Facebook, of whom there's a few, but those we do observe actually have better devices than men in general. They're have better educated than men in general. That's the ones we do see, sort of. Right? So we see like a very elite group of women, and then sort of you extrapolate out, and that sort of messes up our model. So here's a different model that doesn't use the percentage iOS, right? Because that's sort of a problematic feature due to this sort of selection bias, but uses only the Facebook penetration itself as a feature. And if you use this model, this performs worse in terms of overall accuracy, but it performs sort of better in a sort of gender disaggregated manner. It's less biased in terms of sort of gender. Then you get a prediction that's at least plausible, right? Then you would basically for every single surveyed location predict that women are doing worse than men in terms of access, to assets. Right. So to wrap up this part again, so we're happy that this is also being continued. So we were working also with a data science company in the Philippines called Thinking Machines, both on the research, but now they also continue to sort of operationalize this. So they've included these features together with other features, not as a standalone feature, in their poverty predicting work that they're doing for UNDP and others. So again, we're happy that there was some sort of capacity building here, and that this sort of continues to be used. I think I will probably skip the gender gap work. So we look at what's going on Facebook to make models for internet access, or at least I skip the details. I'll just show. Sorry for this. Just sort of. So one thing about what's going on in Afghanistan, because it shows sort of the timeliness. I mean, the sort of how recent things are. I think that's one of the selling points. So I'm sure you're aware of the takeover of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and a lot of questions what this means for gender equality in particular. And so here in black, we're showing the number of daily active users. So previously it was monthly active users, and now daily active users aged 15 to 19, and just girls, sort of. So these are adolescent girls on Facebook in Afghanistan. So, since sort of late 2018, the number was going down, down, and down. And that's sort of globally observed, right? There's sort of Facebook is using market share among teenagers in general, among sort of, women in particular, sort of to Snapchat and other sort of, alternatives, also Instagram. Now, this sort of stopped in sort of, this sort of decline stopped in sort of 2000. And then with the sort of the beginning of the Taliban offensive, it actually increased. It dropped during the fall of Kabul. This is when Kabul fell. And then it jumped to levels never seen before, at least in many, many years, when there was a campaign on social media about do not touch my clothes. Basically, there was a sort of a Taliban law outlawing certain types of clothing, if I'm not mistaken. There was like a counter sort of, action on sort of social media, sort of. Right? And so anyway, so here the story is it's actually somewhat maybe surprising, maybe hopeful, maybe expected, I'm not sure, but that somehow the actions of the Taliban seems to have energized social media use, or at least sort of Facebook use among teenage girls, right? Not just in terms of absolute numbers, but also down here in sort of turquoise or so. I'm showing the female to male ratio, which has also gone up. So not only are there more women, but they're also making up a bigger share of the sort of age cohort. We're also now doing more work subnationally for this gender gap mapping in terms of predicting internet access and mobile phone gender gaps. So this is work we're now doing in Africa at the administrative 2 level. Happy to talk more about it this time. Okay, but I want to have some time for at least some sort of thoughts and discussions. So first, quickly recap strengths, weaknesses. I showed Facebook. I could have shown other platforms. It's just biggest game in town. Relatively real time. It's anonymous and aggregate. So I don't think privacy in the original sense is the main concern. There are many concerns, but I don't think individual privacy is the main one. A lot of different sort of targeting attributes, and it's free of charge, right? All wonderful, right? You can collect lots of data for free. Now, what are the drawbacks? Black box, we already mentioned. I don't know exactly how Facebook knows somebody moved, right? And furthermore, this black box can change over time. That's a huge drawback we already discussed. Clearly not representative, right? This sort of Jackie Robinson bias, right? Where in India you only have the elite women on the platform, right? So you have to be aware of these sort of weird things that can crop up. It uses the gender dichotomy, right? Only sort of male, female, right? Not everybody fits in that, but that's sadly what's being used in advertising sort of. Also, that's the only thing we can use. And so users patterns also change over time. So this means that if we were now to build a system on top of this and have it run across many, many years, probably our models will break down at some point, right? That might work for 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, but 5, 6, 10 years from now, if Facebook is still around, clearly users pattern will have changed, to make the models useless. There's no historic data available, right? So if you ask me, okay, what happened, at the beginning of COVID-19 in some country, I cannot tell you through this platform, right? There's no business case to now ask, how would my ad have performed if I was to launch an ad 2 years ago, right? I mean, this sort of the platform sort of offers. And lastly, but not, sort of this is an important one, is there's risk of misuse concerning group level harm, not individual, not privacy of individuals, but group level harm, right? I can identify vulnerable populations, right? I mean, I can map migrants as sort of. Maybe, I mean, I'm trying to help them in the setting of, Venezuela and Colombia, but conceptually, right? You could, for example, try to map the Rohingya in Myanmar, right? I mean, they're not migrants, but sort of in other sort of vulnerable populations. Now, in that particular case, fortunately, because I tried, it doesn't work because they're so disenfranchised. They don't seem to be on the internet in general, let alone on Facebook. But you could, imagine other sort of cases, right? Another story: until a month ago, you could also target people based on religious interests. I could have created a map of where in Germany people are interested in Jewish holidays, right? Which again is sort of, being German, knowing history, that makes me uneasy, sort of. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, Facebook has removed a lot of these attributes just a month ago. So now this sort of targeting based on religious interests is no longer possible, right? Because hopefully they've, observed this might be too risky. Other things going beyond plus minus. So this is, one of the rare forms of sort of data sharing with academics, sort of, right? Like sort of, which is has been used by a lot of people also for auditing, sort of how privacy worked, and there were a lot of shortcomings there. One of the potential criticism is, are we helping Facebook to whitewash their activities, right? Because now I'm saying, see, you can do all this great work with Facebook data, and people then might say, aha, but now you're drawing attention away from all the hate speech and other issues that are going on Facebook, right? So this is also important to mind. Hopefully I don't come across as an advocating for Facebook or sort of. Right? I'm just sort of trying to use sort of existing data, but of course could be used also by Facebook themselves in that way. It creates some interesting power dynamics. So we are also working with the European Commission on compiling migration statistics. And so on the one hand, European Commission uses this data and sees a lot of value in it. At the other hand, European Commission wants to regulate Facebook, sort of, right? So sort of, they're sort of trying to talk to them. Hey, can we have more of your great data? But also, by the way, we want to shut you down, sort of, right? Like it's an interesting dynamic, right? And then last but not least, it's really great bang for the buck, right? Actually, it's very easy to use, sort of, it's much easier to also teach others and sort of to analyze sort of satellite imagery. So it's you can very quickly do some sort of GIS modeling using this data, and it'll probably perform at least as well as satellite imagery, but much less effort involved. If I have okay, maybe quickly, so you can go beyond. I'll take the question in a second. I'm almost finished, and then I'll take the question. So you can also go beyond just passive use. You can launch an ad, and then you can ask people to take a survey. You can do things related to sort of public health messaging that's more targeted than a one size fits all. Skip all the details. Last thing I want to mention is we're now doing something this sort of on-demand social sensing, where let's imagine there's an earthquake happening somewhere, then we want to automatically, create a map of certain locations to target. In those locations, we would then advertise a simple poll. I mean, not like this poll here, whether you have a superpower or not, but do you still live in your normal residence, or is there flooding in your street, or is there electricity in your building, or sort of so, right? Like sort of so, and then we would sort of hopefully, in the best case, within a couple of hours, create a map of sort of how different areas are affected, sort of so. It's very sort of sort of social remote sort of social sensing. And then my last slide. Oh no, one more after this. Sorry. We do this work with this sort of following this mantra. Better data will lead to better decisions, sort of so, right? And it sounds nice, but it's not clear that whether that's true, right? Like if you think about sort of global warming, we've known the data for decades, and things are not really being used for better decisions, sort of, right? And so even though I do this work, and hopefully I hope it's helpful, hopefully it will lead to better decisions. I mean, I also don't want to say this is this is generally the case, sort of, right? So hopefully it helps at least to highlight systematic issues, but just having data doesn't solve those issues. And then one advertising slide. So if this sort of thing is of interest to you, if you happen to work also on social media data, we are organizing a special track at ACM Good IT, which will be in its first year this year. It's a new sort of conferences, looking at sort of good uses of ICT. We have a great program committee. A lot of people also from the UN sector, sort of UNICEF, World Bank, OCHA, IOM, as well as a lot of academics. And so, if this is of interest, go to socialmediaforgood.org or just sort of ping me, and I'll send you pointers. So thanks a lot for sticking around. Happy to, if there's still time, happy to discuss more and take more questions.
Thank you so much, Ingmar. That was really wonderful. I think we do have a few minutes for questions, if that's all right with you to stay a bit over.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It would be great. This is all very, I think, resonating with a lot of us, thinking about all these questions, like where does data help, especially your last point, and where it might actually lead to wrong decisions or conclusions. There's a question that was in the chat from Lodewijk, and then we'll go to Mihail, who raised his hand. Lodewijk is asking, is collecting this data permitted by Facebook terms of use? How likely is it that they would shut down the data collection pipelines when they get popular, or maybe more importantly, when the findings are inconvenient to them?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So we have not found anything in the terms of use that goes against this use. Anything that we found is sort of against of the use. So once you start an advertising campaign, there are certain then sort of the terms of use talk about what you can do with that sort of data, but we never get to that stage of actually launching an ad campaign. So at least as far as we know, we have not. Also, Facebook is well aware of our work in this space. I mean, I've spoken about this work at Facebook, itself. Will they shut it down? It's hard to see how, because it's so fundamental to their business model, sort of. So I mean, they can certainly limit the access, right? Like make it harder and harder, sort of. So, but so that might increase the threshold. Maybe you actually have to run an ad for a while to sort of maintain access. That's imaginable, I guess. But to sort of remove the access completely, I just cannot see how it goes, because people need it for their campaigns, right? And also, it's also not reasonable to charge people before they launch the campaign, right? Again, because you need this for planning, sort of. So again, they might restrict it maybe a bit more, but I can't see how they would completely shut it off, sort of. So, because again, it's just sort of, I mean, that's the nice thing, right? It's really tied to the business model. It's really at its core. It's not something nice to have. We'll share some data with academics. No, this is the business model. So I don't see. Yeah, I think that those were the questions. Are other questions or comments, or maybe I missed part of the question?
I think that I mean, Lodewijk, unless you want to chime in a little bit more, that kind of addresses the question you had. But we can also give let Michael, who has his hand raised, I think you can ask a question too.
Okay, thank you very much, Ingmar. Thank you very much for the presentation. Really fantastic and super clever way how to use this data. I was really amazed on that. Kind of two questions or some kind of arguments on how you were interpreting two types of data. The one was about the origin of Venezuelans to another country, and etc. And how and your argument was kind of they went. The ones that went to Brazil, to this kind of a really isolated area in Amazon, they became, this had an impact on their income, or the other one that went to United States that has an impact on their income the positive way. So
I wouldn't interpret it this way, So our assumption so far, it might be this way, but so far it was more about people of this type go there. At least that was our current.
Yeah, because this is how I thought you were interpreting. It's kind of my interpretation is kind of people of low resources will go to Brazil and etc. to the Amazon,
yes.
And people with much more resources
yes.
will go to United States and Spain because you need a flight or because you need to have a family or someone over there in this kind of home of countries in order to receive it. So it's kind of you can use it as a kind of variation in terms of the background of the people that move into these countries and etc. So, and this is the first one. Second is about the Afghan girls. So if, again, it's kind of the way you interpret it is kind of the change in the country incentivized the Facebook usage by the young girls in Afghanistan. This is kind of how you interpreted it. But my interpretation was kind of, since our social lives now have two points, the digital social life and the physical social life. If for those girls, there is no physical social life, then all their social life becomes digital. So by this way, we increment, so it will increment the usage of Facebook and etc. Not necessarily this incentivize them to do much more, but it's kind of substitution effect. So all their physical activity now has become digital. It kind of source, you can think it in terms of COVID, and it's kind of a first in lockdowns and etc. We are transformed our physical activity to digital activity. So not necessarily that it incentivizes them to do much more, but kind of substitution effect on that. And a kind of a final, it's what's kind of your thoughts on that and comment. So Facebook has all this kind of data and etc. But on top of that, they can, through trackers and etc., they can also track the activity of non-Facebook users. I don't know how this you could interpret it and combine it with your own data and etc. On that, I can send you much more work that has been done on try to identify this kind of tracking of users that they're not belonging to that they're not as Facebook users through this kind of Facebook trackers that you have on the web page.
Yeah, interesting. So on the last point, yeah, it's a very good point. And sometimes I just to show people who are not aware of this, I sometimes go like to even Harvard's webpage, and I look at the network monitoring while on the page, right? And you see that they're like trackers from Facebook or sort of being loaded, right? So Facebook, Harvard would know, or through, Facebook knows who visits Harvard's website, or and so
exactly. So it would know even your account if you even though you didn't have an account, somehow yes. You will get some information about that.
Right. Yeah. So that's true. So we have not. I don't know how we could access that data through the advertising platform, but it's certainly part of this ecosystem somehow. But I don't know how to tap into it. But it's an interesting thought. If you have more ideas, definitely do send me a point. I'd be happy to look into this. In terms of interpretation, yeah, absolutely. I think that's also one of the sort of general like big limitations of this whole big data, right? Like it's sort of it lacks the richness, right? It shows us this graph going up and down, and that's it, right? I don't know why the graph is going up and down, sort of. So it might very well be the sort of substitution that you that you mentioned, sort of. So like the only reason I thought it was more of we need to organize, we need to do something about this, rather than was also this sort of peak when this sort of big social media campaign was happening, like "Do not touch my clothes," with a sort of fairly sustained, still high level afterwards. But you are right; it doesn't prove this sort of. So I don't have on the ground experience or sort of feedback. It was sort of your hypothesis at least as valid as our hypothesis, similarly to what, at least in the migration setting, I think our assumption was mostly about the sort of pre-migration socioeconomic situation, sort of, right? That you would sort of take your device with you, right? And if you're let's just poor versus rich. I mean, it's oversimplified, right? If you're poor, you have an Android device. If you're rich, you have an iOS device. I mean, it's oversimplified, right? But for sake of argument, right? And then we sort of just observe where do these devices end up, rather than now you're rich and now you upgrade your device. I mean, we could potentially even look at those because we have the particular device type we could look at, but that we haven't done. So yeah, you're right. So the different interpretations are possible.
I have a bit of a simple question. You mentioned that, well, that almost identical methodology can be used over different social media platforms with different advertising platforms. Do you see variability by saying and repeating the same experiment? And is it sizable, or there's some context in which it's more than others? And are there, I'm guessing there are probably examples where you use these as just different data points in terms of some demographic extrapolation. And I'd just be curious to see, as someone who perhaps is not as well versed on what users and usages on different social media platforms is, what that variability looks like.
Yeah, it's a good question. So for some of our work on mapping internet access gender gaps, we've also used data from Google in particular, so Google's display network, to be more specific. And they are sort of, Facebook and Google were fairly strongly correlated already, and you could use either one to get more or less similar results. Facebook itself was actually slightly better in terms of predicting internet access gender gaps, and if you combine the two, you get a slight boost over Facebook, but not really, not huge, and almost not even to the point of sort of making worth the effort to sort of include another data set but they were very sort of similar just at that point. We've also done some work with UNICEF looking just at teenage gender gaps. For that, we also looked at Snapchat and Instagram in particular, where broadly speaking, sort of teenage digital gender gaps map sort of country level gender gaps in terms of sort of gender use, but there are some certainly country differences. I forgot. In particular for Snapchat, there were some outliers where you had like 5 times more teenage girls than boys on the platform or something. I forgot the specific countries, but there were sort of some, I don't know what caused those effects, due to, I don't know, marketing or something, or just how the platform grew so there was sort of weird sort of generation, whereas Facebook is maybe just because it's sort of higher saturation of the total population, we never had this sort of really strong weird outliers so that we observed there. Yeah, other than that, it's really sort of for some countries you have like again for China we looking at Weibo to sort of look at sort of gender gaps across China, and for other countries you could potentially look at, I don't know, Contact or other platforms. We haven't done that.
All right, thank you. I guess, well, since we're a little bit now, I mean, thank you so much for taking the time to stay long with
no,
us.
it's a pleasure.
If there aren't any more questions, I'm thinking maybe we could wrap up for today. I don't know if anyone else here would like to add some final questions, but I guess since not, thank you so much for taking the time, Ingmar. It was an incredibly interesting talk, and I know I'm looking forward to sharing this and this material with many people in our group. We've been fascinated with the work that you've been doing with Venezuelan migrants, and it's great to see how easy it is to get this data and to start using it. So
yes,
yeah, really
definitely. Also,
use.
if anybody on the on the call uses, use this World Bank repository as a starter, and otherwise feel free to get in touch. I'd be happy to either help you or maybe even collaborate on this sort of. So definitely do get in touch.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, and thank everyone for being here with us, and we hope to catch everyone here soon for our next colloquium talk.